Further to what I said in the last clip, the concept of normalcy in psychoanalytic traditions is basically divided into two separate ideas of normalcy. In the Freudian tradition, represented by Winnicott as one of the more influential and most understandable psychoanalytic authors, the mental health criteria, the mental health culture, the very structure of mental health lies in the depths. It contains dark elements of which we are shamed and frightened, and the task of psychoanalysis is to bring those scary pieces of content to the forefront so that the person might become partially aware of them and accept those parts of the authentic self, this dark, not entirely nice self, that make one feel more complete and more in touch with one's true identity. So once we accept those things that we have forced ourselves to forget or to push into the unconscious or subconscious, we are supposed to feel more complete and more at peace with ourselves. Contrariwise, the Lacanian view, the other concept of normalcy in the psychoanalytic tradition, is that normalcy is the opposite of the darkness of the Jungian shadow. Normalcy is the good, constructive, functional life, lived amongst one's peers in a society, a life that embodies the values shared by most. Normalcy is not the diving into the bottomless subconscious, chasing nasty shadows. It is living an upstanding life, whilst finding sufficient satisfaction for the effort expended to make one's relationships worthwhile. The way in which a child and later a person becomes mentally well or psychologically sound is through embracing and critically understanding the normativity of community membership, and the most important vehicle for this is the role of the father. Name of the father, the main signifier in Lacanian psychoanalysis. The main signifier as the paradigm of authority and a normative presence in a person's life decides the person's prospects in terms of their mental health in later life. This is the role played by educators and by education as a process. The blockage of name of the father, according to Lacanians, leads to neurosis. And the cancelling of name of the father, as in the current cancelling culture of the woke ideology, leads to psychosis. What happens to the authority of fathers in time also happens to the authority of teachers and educators. The same happens to all authorities in society that approximates name of the father. Religious authorities, cultural authorities, and scientific authorities. Their gradual cancellation is a road to collective psychosis. In a broader sense, name of the father symbolizes moral and social normativity. Thus, for Lacanians, madness is a serious deviation from the basic standards of moral and social normativity. This idea is very much in line with traditional pre-positivistic, pre-Kraepelin psychiatry, and is perhaps best illustrated by Philip Pinel, the founder of the modern psychotherapeutic clinic, who equated all psychotherapy with moral re-education. This means that Winnicott's false self is closer to the Lacanian standards of normalcy than is the true self. Assuming that the true self is something like what Jung called the shadow, the true self as the dark self, the self we are ashamed of, which is true, but at the same time we can't admit to its truth. The false self is the self that is easy to accept, to embrace, and to show to the others. Normalcy is structure, normativity, accountability, responsibility, empathy, and resilience. According to Lacan, what Winnicott called a false self is in fact the real self of a normal person. Normalcy is a social ideal for Lacan, not a dark face encountered in the murky depths of the subconscious. This key difference between the two conceptualizations of normalcy reflects in modern culture. In particular, it is associated with the postmodern amorphousness of social norms and the consequent relativity of what is considered normal. The confusion reflects particularly ominously in education. One of the most direct reflections of this ambiguity about normalcy and socialization is associated with the influence of the so-called woke movement, which has since been described more as a cult than as a legitimate social movement on all levels of education. The woke movement is a complex gathering of various attempts to destroy what the Lacanians would consider the structural foundations of normalcy, not least the role of authority and leadership symbolized by the primary signifying name of the father. It was likely initiated by radical feminism and its erroneous and damaging interpretation of history as a kind of patriarchal tyranny, and was subsequently facilitated by insistence by radical feminists on destruction of the family as a fundamental precondition for the so-called freedom and for the so-called free development of children. The two misconceptions, the misinterpretation of social history as patriarchal domination and the assumption that destruction of the family is a road towards social progress, have been beautifully incorporated in the modern woke agenda, as the cult has spread its tentacles so widely that some of the most traditionally resilient democracies are starting to raise their voice against the destruction of the society embarked on by the cult. Thus, British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak announced in January 2023 that he would appoint an anti-woke tsar, or government representative, most likely a Cambridge academic, to oversee the woke abuse in universities. The abuse is reflected in the systematic stifling of free speech and a perversion of language to the effect of creating confusion in normative anomie. Arguably, the most famous psychologist worldwide, Jordan Peterson, has already been stripped of his academic position at the University of British Columbia for refusing to address a female woke student as they. And at the time of writing of this paper, he's being prosecuted by the Ontario College of Psychologists. And at the time of recording of this video, he's being prosecuted or persecuted by the Ontario College of Psychologists, which threatens to take away his license to practice clinical psychology on account of his conservative political statements made online. Examples are numerous, but the two above, the two that I just mentioned, illustrate the degree to which the woke ideology has infiltrated the educational and professional regulatory institutions in the West, and the extent to which the anti-structural and anti-hierarchical, anti-authority model of social change has penetrated modern culture. Some of the consequences of this type of woke abuse of both public policy and education include the pathologization of public discourse and of the educational process itself. On at least one psychoanalytic account, attempts to dispense with name of the father as at once the symbol of a hierarchy of competence and a beacon of normalcy in the psychiatric sense amount to psychotic policies aimed to pathologize the entire society. I believe this is what the British government is trying to combat by instituting review and investigation for universities that sanction non-woke speech. The violence against language is exemplified in addressing individuals in plural and in third person, such as they. This practice not only linguistically adulterates the consensual foundations, the agreement on the meanings of communication in society, it also undermines the key identities on which our very understanding of self and others are based, and induce a Durkheimian anomie or confusion that allows any type of hijacking of the public agenda and falsifying the procedural guarantees of a democratic society. So what we're basically facing is the destruction of democracy alongside the destruction of the very structure of the hierarchy and authority and organicism that are inherent in the customary concept of normalcy.